Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick with us. Now, this week we are celebrating World Music Therapy Week, which is a time dedicated to recognizing the power of music as a clinical, evidence-based tool for connection, healing, and change. And alongside that, April also marks World Autism Month, which is a moment to deepen our understanding of autism, not just in terms of diagnosis, but in terms of lived experience, identity, and the many different ways that people connect with the world. Now, I've absolutely been loving Love on the Spectrum on Netflix recently, which I can't lie, inspired me even more to do today's episode. So today we're sitting at the intersection of both autism and music. Now, music is often described as a universal language, but that idea becomes much more meaningful when we actually consider it in the context of autism, because for many autistic individuals, music is not just something that they listen to, it's something that they respond to, regulate through, and sometimes something that they use to communicate in ways that words just can't. So in this episode, we're going to explore the science and the psychology behind music therapy and its application specifically in autism. We're going to look at what autism actually is and how it shapes communication, sensory experience, and communication. I also want to break down what music therapy really involves and why it works, not just emotionally, but neurologically and behaviorally. And of course, we'll explore what the research tells us, where it's strong, where it's limited, and what it reveals overall about the role of music in human connection. So, let's get into it. But to ground this conversation, first off, I think it's important to begin with a clear, accurate, and honestly respectful understanding of what we mean by autism, especially since this episode sits within World Autism Month. So clinically, autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD, is defined as a neurodevelopmental condition that affects how individuals communicate, interact, learn, and experience the world. So the National Institute of Mental Health describes it as a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. And this is actually a definition that's grounded in the diagnostic framework of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or also known as the DSM-5, which is used by clinicians all over the world. Now, within this framework, autism is characterized by two core domains: persistent differences in social communication and interaction, and restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Now, the reason that autism is described as a spectrum is because of the sheer diversity in how it presents itself. There is no single autistic experience. Some individuals are nonverbal, while others are highly articulate, and some require significant day-to-day support, while others live completely independently. And cognitive profiles can range from intellectual disability to above average intelligence. But beyond these kind of visible differences, what truly defines autism is not just what is seen externally, but also how the world is processed internally. I think rather than viewing autism purely through a deficit-based lens, a more accurate and increasingly accepted perspective is to understand it as a difference in how the brain processes information. Many autistic individuals experience differences in both verbal and nonverbal communication, which the DSM-5 describes in terms of social-emotional reciprocity and conversational flow. In practice, this might look like difficulty with back-and-forth conversation, challenges interpreting tone, sarcasm, or implied meaning, or just expressing thoughts and emotions in more conventional ways. But these differences do not reflect a lack of intelligence or feeling whatsoever. They purely reflect a different kind of communication system. And similarly, differences in social interaction may include challenges in developing, maintaining, or understanding relationships, which the DSM-5 explicitly identifies as a diagnostic feature of autism. But however, I think it's crucial to challenge a common misconception here that these differences don't mean a lack of desire for connection whatsoever. In many cases, the desire to connect is very much present, but the pathways to doing so may look different. For example, being less reliant on typical social cues and more grounded in shared interests, structure, or alternative forms of expression. But one of the most important and overlooked dimensions of autism is sensory experience. The DSM-5 includes hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input as a core feature, really highlighting that autistic individuals may experience the world in ways that are either intensely overwhelming or understimulating. So sounds might feel too loud, lights too bright, or environments too chaotic and unpredictable. But equally, some individuals may seek out strong sensory input through movement, sound, or touch as a way of kind of regulating their internal state. And this sensory dimension is not peripheral, it's fundamentally shaping how their world is experienced, navigated, and responded to. Historically, autism has often been framed in terms of impairment or dysfunction, but a more contemporary and widely supported perspective is this neurodiversity approach, which really understands autism as a natural variation in human cognition. From this perspective, autism isn't something to be fixed, but it's something to be understood and supported. This shift is especially important in the context of therapy, where the goal is not to normalize behavior, but to support communication, enable expression, and just improve overall quality of life in a way that really respects the individual's unique way of being. And this is where music begins to enter the conversation. Many autistic individuals demonstrate strong, even heightened relationships with music. Research and clinical observations suggest that music may be processed more intuitively than language, that rhythm and melody can feel more predictable and structured than speech, and that musical engagement can really help to elicit responses in individuals who may otherwise struggle with verbal communication. In some cases, musical responsiveness appears to be preserved or even enhanced, creating these opportunities for connection that really just bypass traditional linguistic pathways overall. And this creates this powerful but important paradox where language can sometimes create distance and music can create connection. So if music has this unique ability to bypass traditional communication pathways and reach people in ways that words sometimes cannot, the next question becomes, what does it actually mean to use music therapeutically? Because music therapy is often misunderstood. It's easy to assume that it simply means putting on some music to relax or just playing a playlist to improve your mood. But clinically, it's something far more structured, intentional, and relational. Now, I did do a whole episode on music therapy versus music as therapy right at the beginning of the Sound Mind in episode 3. So if you want a whole episode on that, then do check that one out in the spirit of World Music Therapy Week. But today, I want to do just a quick overview of what music therapy is as a practice before we get into its applications for autism in particular. So, okay, what is music therapy? Music therapy is defined by the American Music Therapy Association as the clinical and evidence-based use of music interventions to accomplish individualized goals within a therapeutic relationship by a credentialed professional. Now, this definition is important for a few reasons. First, it emphasizes that music therapy is clinical and evidence-based, meaning that it's grounded in research and applied within healthcare, educational, and therapeutic settings. Secondly, it highlights that it is delivered by trained and credentialed therapists. So, not just musicians, but professionals who are trained in psychology, human development, and therapeutic techniques alongside musical skills. So, just to reiterate as well, I am not a licensed music therapist. I'm not trained in music therapy. I'm not a music therapy practitioner. I'm just a music psychologist who has studied the psychology of music, and I'm coming at this from an academic perspective. But the third thing about this definition is that it really highlights that music therapy is goal-oriented. So it's not just about engaging with music for enjoyment, but it's about using music intentionally to support specific outcomes, such as improving communication, enhancing emotional expression, developing social skills, or supporting cognitive and motor functioning. Now, the World Federation of Music Therapy similarly defines music therapy as the professional use of music and its elements as an intervention in medical, educational, and everyday environments with individuals, groups, families, or communities. So, at the core of both of these definitions is one key idea. Music is not the end goal, it's the medium. And perhaps the most important distinction to make, especially in the context of autism, is that music therapy isn't about playing music to someone. It's about creating music with them. Because what makes music therapy so powerful is not just the sound itself, but the interaction that it enables. In practice, music therapy is highly adaptable, but there are several core techniques that are commonly used, particularly in work with autistic individuals. So one of the most central approaches is improvisation. Now, this involves the therapist and the client co-creating music in real time, often using simple instruments, voice, or rhythm. Now, there's no kind of right or wrong way to do this. The focus is just on expression and interaction between the therapist and the client. Improvisation allows the therapist to meet the individual exactly where they are in that moment, both musically and emotionally, and to really build this kind of shared musical language. Now, research has shown that improvisational music therapy can significantly improve social engagement and joint attention in autistic children, precisely because it creates this dynamic, responsive interaction rather than a fixed task. Closely related to this is musical mirroring, where the therapist reflects or imitates the sounds, rhythms, or movements of the individual. So if someone taps a rhythm, the therapist might echo it back. If they vocalize, the therapist responds musically. This mirroring can validate the individual's expression and create a sense of being heard and understood, often without a single word being spoken. Now, from a psychological perspective, this really taps into mechanisms of attunement and synchrony, which are foundational for social connection and emotional bonding. Now, another key technique is call and response, which is a structured form of interaction where one person produces a musical phrase and the other responds. Now, this can be as simple as a rhythmic pattern or as complex as a kind of melodic exchange. But importantly, call and response mirrors the fundamental structure of a conversation. It introduces turn taking, anticipation, and reciprocity, all of which are core components of communication that may be challenging, especially for autistic individuals. Now, by embedding these skills within music, they can be practiced in a way that feels natural and less cognitively demanding than verbal interaction. Songwriting is another really powerful tool, particularly for emotional expression and identity development. Now, in this context, individuals may create their own lyrics, melodies, or both, often with support from the therapist. This process allows for the kind of externalization of thoughts and feelings that might be difficult to articulate verbally. For some, it becomes a way of telling their story, and for others, it's a way of processing emotions or making sense of experiences. Studies have shown that songwriting interventions can support emotional regulation, self-expression, and self-awareness, particularly in populations where verbal expression is limited. So, across all of these techniques, what remains consistent is the emphasis on relationship. Music therapy is in no way a passive experience, it's an interactive, co created process. The music therapist is constantly adapting, responding, and shaping the musical environment based on the individual's needs, responses, and goals. And this responsiveness is what allows music therapy to be so effective, particularly for individuals who may find traditional forms of communication inaccessible or overwhelming. And neurologically, this makes sense, right? Music engages multiple brain systems simultaneously, including those involved in emotion, movement, attention, and reward. And because of this, it provides these multiple entry points for engagement. Now, research in neuroscience has shown that active music making can facilitate integration across brain networks, supporting not just isolated skills, but more holistic forms of functioning, particularly in areas like social communication. So, when we talk about music therapy, we're not just talking about music as sound. We're talking about music as interaction, communication, and connection. And in the context of autism, where traditional pathways to connection may look different, this becomes so powerful because it offers this kind of alternative route, one that's not dependent on words, but on something more fundamental: rhythm, timing, and shared experience. And so, if autism fundamentally shapes how someone experiences communication, social interaction, and the sensory world, and music taps directly into those same systems, we arrive at a crucial question for this episode, which is what happens when we bring the two together? Why does music, more than many other interventions, seem to open up pathways for communication, connection, and expression in autistic individuals? Well, the answer lies in a combination of structure, predictability, embodiment, and relational interaction, all of which are not only psychologically meaningful, but also increasingly supported by research, specifically in autism and music therapy. Now, one of the most important mechanisms here is predictable structure. Music, by its very nature, is patterned. Rhythms repeat, phrases resolve, and timing is consistent. And for autistic individuals who may experience social interaction as unpredictable and cognitively demanding, this structure can feel significantly more accessible. In fact, clinical research notes that autistic children often show a strong preference for music precisely because it's structured and systematic, and therefore more predictable than social interaction. This predictability reduces uncertainty, which can in turn reduce anxiety and sensory overload. Rhythm becomes this kind of framework that organizes experience and creates this sense of safety. Now, closely linked to this is the role of repetition, which is really fundamental to both music and learning. Repetition in music provides consistency, which allows individuals to anticipate what's coming next and gradually participate more actively. Now, in autism, where preference for routine and repetition is common, this alignment becomes particularly powerful. Now, a systematic review of randomized controlled trials found that repeated music therapy sessions, often delivered multiple times per week over several months, were associated with improvements in social communication, emotional responsiveness, and cognitive processing in autistic children. Now, repetition here is really helping to reinforce neural pathways, supporting learning and enabling regulation. Music also functions as a form of nonverbal communication, which is especially significant given that autism is characterized by differences in verbal and nonverbal communication. Unlike speech, which requires complex linguistic processing, music operates through rhythm, pitch, timing, and dynamics, and these elements can convey intention and emotion without requiring words. Now, studies have shown that music therapy can improve social communication skills and interaction in autistic children, even when verbal language remains limited. So, in this sense, music creates this kind of alternative communication system, one that bypasses traditional language barriers and allows expression to emerge in a more accessible form. And this connects directly to music's role in emotional access and expression. Emotions can be difficult to identify, interpret, or articulate, particularly for individuals who experience these differences in emotional processing. Music provides this way to externalize these internal states. Changes in tempo, melody, or intensity can reflect shifts in emotion without requiring this explicit verbalization. Now, research into music therapy for autism has found improvements in emotional responsiveness and effective engagement, suggesting that music can act as a bridge between internal experience and outward expression. And most importantly, this process isn't forced. It unfolds naturally through interaction, reducing pressure and allowing for this kind of more authentic expression. But perhaps the most powerful mechanism is synchrony, the act of being in time with another person. So when individuals share musical activities such as drumming, clapping, or singing, they're coordinating their actions in real time. And this synchronization introduces fundamental elements of social interaction, including turn taking, shared attention, and responsiveness, but in a way that feels intuitive rather than full of effort. Now, research in music therapy interventions has shown that these kinds of structured, interactive musical engages can lead to measurable improvements in social skills and engagement in autistic children. But even more, studies comparing music therapy to passive music listening have found that active, relational music making leads to greater clinical improvement, highlighting that it's not just the music itself, but it's actually that shared interaction that matters the most. Now, these mechanisms are not just theoretical. As I've mentioned, they are reflected across real-world therapeutic outcomes. In clinical settings, therapists often observe nonverbal children initiating interaction through rhythm, so tapping a drum, repeating a pattern, or responding to a musical cue when they don't respond to speech. Parent-child relationships can also shift through shared musical engagement, creating these moments of connection that might not occur through verbal interaction alone. Think increased eye contact, longer periods of engagement, and more reciprocal interaction are super frequently reported outcomes of music therapy sessions. It's such an amazing thing to witness. When I was working in community music settings, I worked with a lot of autistic children as well, and it is just absolutely amazing to see them come alive in a setting that perhaps they don't get to experience in more conventional daily settings. So, yeah, it's such a growing field, and there are so many impacts beyond communication alone as well. It's really, really worth putting the research into this and continuing to engage and allowing music therapists to do the amazing work that they do today. There's also this growing interest in the neurological mechanisms underlying these effects as well. Emerging research suggests that music therapy might support functional brain connectivity, particularly between auditory, motor, and social processing regions, which are networks that are often implicated in autism. And this points to the possibility that music isn't just facilitating surface level behavioral changes, but actually supporting deeper integration across different brain systems involved in communication and social interaction, which is absolutely amazing. But I think the most important point to hold on to here is that the purpose of music therapy in autism is not to make individuals more quote unquote typical. It's not just about enforcing eye contact or about at all correcting behavior or conforming to these conventional standards of communication. Instead, it's about creating environments where communication can emerge naturally and where expression is accessible and where connection is really possible on the individual's own terms, because at its core, music therapy isn't about fixing, it's about understanding. Now, I want to finish off by bringing everything together with something a bit more real and tangible. I came across a case study from the British Association for Music Therapy that really captures what this can look like in practice. So I thought it would be really helpful to kind of run through that and really follow their journey. So it follows a 10-year-old autistic child in a specialist school setting. It really just paints the picture so beautifully. So at the beginning of therapy, he had no functional spoken language. He made vocal sounds, but they were often very repetitive, and he spent a lot of time engaged in sensory behaviors, things like fixating on objects or repeating movements. Social interaction was also very limited, and when people tried to engage him in more structured ways, it often led to withdrawal or distress. Now, what's interesting is that the therapist didn't try to change that straight away. She didn't try to correct the behavior or push him into these more typical forms of communication. Instead, she met him where he was. She started by observing him closely, his movements and his rhythms, and then reflecting those back musically. So if he tapped, she tapped. If he made a sound, she responded. And gradually, they began to build something shared, this kind of musical space based on his own actions. And over time, things started to shift. At first, it was small changes. He began to tolerate the therapist being there for longer. And then he started to respond more to what she was doing musically. And there's one moment from the case that really stands out. The therapist sang his name slowly, holding the final note, and then he turned, made eye contact and clapped and moved towards her. It was a small moment, but it really marked something big, which was the beginning of a reciprocal interaction. And from there, the sessions became more dynamic. They started playing together, mirroring each other on instruments, moving in sync. Sometimes they even used a mirror in the room, which made eye contact feel less intense, but still allowed for that shared attention. It created this kind of safe middle ground where connection didn't feel overwhelming, but it was still happening. And then communication started to emerge, but not in the way that you might expect. He began identifying parts of his face in the mirror and saying words like eyes, nose, and mouth. But these weren't taught in a traditional, structured way. They came out of this shared musical interaction. The therapist described it as music becoming a kind of practice space for communication, where sound, movement, and meaning could slowly come together without pressure. But what's amazing is that this didn't just stay in the therapy room. His family started noticing changes at home as well, more attempts to communicate, more shared attention and emotional stability. Not a complete transformation, not a quote-unquote cure, because of course that should not exist, but something quieter and in many ways kind of more meaningful. An expansion in how he could connect with others. And this is exactly what we see reflected in the research as well. Studies consistently show that music therapy can support things like social interaction, joint attention, emotional responsiveness, and the initiation of communication, especially when it's interactive and relational rather than passive. In fact, shared music making tends to be more effective than simply listening, like I mentioned earlier, because it's not just about the music, it's about the relationship with it. And this is an amazing example of that. So when you put the research and the real life stories together, this clear idea really comes up that music therapy isn't really about teaching language or replacing it. It's about creating a different kind of communicative environment, one that's embodied, rhythmic, and shared. And within that space, communication doesn't start with instruction. It starts with interaction, and not with correction, but with connection. So when we take a step back and look at everything that we've explored in today's episode, it's clear that music therapy doesn't work because it teaches communication in the traditional sense. It works because it redefines what communication can be. Music therapy offers a way of meeting someone where they are rather than where we expect them to be. It offers a space where expression doesn't rely on words, where interaction isn't driven by rules, and connection can really emerge on different terms, on their terms. It's almost like a reminder that communication was never meant to be limited to language, and music is just so, so powerful in that sense. So, this World Music Therapy Week, I encourage you to really do your own research. Get on YouTube and watch some sessions of music therapy taking place. I promise you, it is the most magical thing that you will experience. It's so heartwarming and beautiful to see these engagements taking place, not just with autistic individuals, but with so many different demographics: mental health, dementia, Alzheimer's, so many different groups that can benefit from music therapy, and music therapists are out there doing such incredible work. So this week, take the time to check out some of those videos. I particularly recommend those done by Nordorf Robbins. You can check them out on YouTube. I can put a link in the description as well, just to have you really see the magic of music therapy this week. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do, or might just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Also, come and say hi over on Instagram and on Threads at the Soundmind Talks. I absolutely love engaging with all of you over there, so come and join the discussion. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.